I want to continue on that note of duality. Just a few points. One is the intellectual context for Korczak's activism. And as some wonderful panelists mentioned before, I guess I can't move with this microphone. I'll start trying to stand still. He was not alone. And he was not alone in a broader sense. He comes out of the context of activism on behalf of orphans that goes back to at least, in his case, early years of the 20th century. He becomes the director of Jewish orphanage, as was mentioned in 1912, but he's already active as a doctor of Children's Hospital in Warsaw and with summer camps for impoverished children in the years before. And if we look at some of the people who worked with him, like Stefania Wilczyńska, they also start early, but really if we step out of Warsaw, we'll find in almost every city such philanthropists, pedagogues, many of them actually physicians, who set up orphanages, who set up schools for children, girls, boys, sometimes they're co-educational, sometimes separate, and they were mostly forgotten. Let me just mention two names from Lwów, Lemberg, Cecilia Kaflenowa and Róża Melzer, who were focusing on Jewish girls, orphans, and poor girls without really much of a future for self-development and becoming who they wanted or could have been without that help. So Korczak is part of a much larger milieu in a Jewish context and of course also in the Polish context of intelligentsia that sees as its calling taking responsibility for those who need assistance, and among them children and especially orphans. And that finds its expression in the duality of institutions with which Korczak is involved throughout his life, beginning with those summer camps that are open to children of all denominations. And it's not simple to organize because of dietary restrictions. How do you set up a kitchen that could cater both to Jewish children and Christian children? And then in setting up the orphanage, working as a doctor at the Jewish hospital, which also received children, poor children of all denominations on certain days. And our house, which was for working class Polish children. It also found its expression in those broadcasts and in his writings, and I think that Olga's point about the language is crucial, that because his language was Polish, by definition really, he wrote and spoke to all children. But his work was also translated for those children that did not read Polish. So his articles on pedagogy, on a treatment of an orphan were published in Yiddish as well, and in Hebrew as well. These were not languages that he was able to write himself, although his grandfather probably could. Nevertheless, that was an open book for all children. And on the subject of the pressure and anti-Semitic pressure that Thomas Hammerberg mentioned in his talk, and to add to that picture that is a picture of an incredible life, but also a life facing many difficulties. One is indeed that with all the respect and attention that Korczak received in his lifetime before the war, he was also attacked, and his duality of identity was questioned on both sides. And yet he maintained that he had the right, and he was active both as a Pole, as a Jew, without deciding and without quitting any of those two identities. And let me introduce our surprise, wonderful speaker, Mr. Samuel Pisar, who is ambassador, honorary ambassador to UNESCO, and who agreed to speak to us today about his experiences, I believe, going back to Białystok and beyond. Thank you very much.
Madam Consul General, dear Eva, Excellencies, my friend Sigmund Rollat, ladies and gentlemen, I am being taken by surprise here. I am in New York by coincidence. Normally I spend most of my time in Paris and in London. But how could I resist Eva and Sigmund when they told me that this morning my place was here? And it so happens that about 2 weeks ago, an emissary of the Polish government came to see me in Paris, the Polish ambassador to UNESCO, in the name of the Polish government, to ask me if I would give the keynote address in September at UNESCO at the Korczak conference, the equivalent of this one, but on a much larger scale. So for me, this was an excellent session because it was a perfect preparation for that challenge. I must tell you that it so happens that I am a survivor of the Holocaust. And I was in fact one of those Korczak orphans, but not in his environment, but in the city of Białystok in eastern Poland. And fate wanted that I should not be one of those children who marched with him to death, but one of those who ended up first in the death camp of Majdanek, then in Auschwitz, then in Dachau. And by some miracle, came out of this totally intact. You, Excellency, have described a few things in which I have recognized myself. And it so happens that in the 1970s, I was invited to Stockholm to give a speech at the Nobel Foundation in the presence of eminent people, including your king and your great Prime Minister Olof Palme, with whom I had a debate after the speech. And in that remarkable, in those surroundings, which was, of course, linked to the Holocaust, I started by telling them the following vignette. It was in the summer of 1943, in the Białystok ghetto. And the Nazis, the SS, were liquidating the ghetto. And my father had already been executed by the Gestapo. And what remained of the family was my mother, my little sister Frida, who was 8 years old, and myself on the verge of 13. And because we heard the shooting and the violence outside, and we knew that our turn would come shortly, when they will take us away. At that moment, as I was getting dressed, my mother said to me, "Don't put on your short pants, put on your long pants." And it was August, it was hot. So I did as I was told. And she added, if you put on your long pants, maybe they will think you're already a man. You know, you are quite tall for your age. And you will go with the men. And I said to her, and what about you? And what about the little one? And she didn't answer. And they all disappeared, we were separated, and I ended up in Majdanek. And during the first selection, as to whether I would go with the dead or the living, I stood before that officer because they said, tailors, go to the left. And something happened in my mind where I thought maybe if they need tailors, they will keep them alive. So I decided I would be a tailor. And this is how I passed the first gate into life rather than into death. I will not bother you with the horrors, of course. I never speak about the horrors. But I became immediately an adult, instantaneously an adult. It was probably a matter of hours, if not of meetings, because in my mother's comment, I figured out that there was an order there to go and try to live. Because my temptation constantly was to walk up to the electrified barbed wire fence and put my hand to it and put a finish to my suffering. But her instructions made that impossible. So out of that, it took some doing, developed a life. And as I listened to you today, I was thinking about the children of Korczak, and I was thinking about the 500 children of my school in Białystok, of whom not one single one survived. And of course I was thinking of the 1.5 million children, all those children who had never lived, all those artists who had never created, all these scientists who have never invented, all these poets who have never written, and who would have so much enriched our world if they had still been alive. Thank you.
This conference, this whole day, in a sense, is a tribute to all those children who suffered, who perished during the Second World War, during the Holocaust, and who perished yesterday and a week ago. So thank you very much for these remarks. Thank you very much, our distinguished panelists. Now we would have a coffee break.